Well, hello everyone, and thank you for checking in on the UK CBAM webinar. This training is about, less than an hour long, and we are zooming in on the UK's carbon border adjustment mechanism. Now, a policy that was announced already in 2023 and is to be enacted in 2027. It is time that we took time to understand what this is all about. So in the next couple of minutes of a time that we have together, I'd like to tell you a little bit about where we are on the CBAM and give you the really high level and very important parts that you need to know to start thinking about what the CBAM in the UK means for you. We're going to take a look a little bit at the plans of the UK to progress to reach net zero by 2050 and how the polluter pays principle plays into all this. This then introduces very nicely and very neatly the UK ETS system, which for customs professionals is a little bit interesting because we're not trained, at least I wasn't, on the UK ETS. So I had to learn about UK ETS to understand how that interlinks with CBAM. So going to look a little bit into this. We also going to introduce CPS. We're going to look at free allowances, would you believe, and why that matters. And then we're going to go into the UK CBAM. We're going to look at the link between UK CBAM and ETS. We're going to look at the UK implementation timeline, so when what is going to happen, in particular with the date of 1 January 2027. We're going to, of course, look at the products concerned in quite a detail. We're going to look at the minimum threshold, which is really great news. And we're going to look at what is a liable person, registration requirements, how to treat CBAM if you're a group, CBAM as a tax, the tax point for CBAM, the CBAM payments, the CBAM tax return, the CBAM accounting. My goodness, I am going crazy already thinking about this. The CBAM tax return, the accounting period, the CBAM liability, the CBAM rate, and how you calculate that. We're going to look at the default value, the recognition of the carbon prices, the determination of embedded emission, direct, indirect, and precursors. And we're going to look at, as I said already, default values and then penalties as well. And then we're going to make a summary and an outlook, and all of this in the next minute. So you can see we have a big program here. But if this is policy of the UK and this is going to happen, then like we do with customs duties and in a way VAT, we need to understand what's actually coming up and how we're going to do this. So this will be the foundation training that you have now. Will it be enough for you to deep dive into every aspect of CBAM? Probably not at this point. However, there's nothing stopping us from doing another training and adding on more training modules, deep diving into some of the sections as legislation develops, as guidance are updated. So with that said, you have a bit of an introduction already of what we're going to cover in the next couple of minutes. So if you're ready to go, I'm going to share my screen and then we're going to have a good go at the UK CBAM. Very exciting. Let's go. All right, so let's take a look at the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the UK CBAM, as it stands right now. So let's start with the very beginning. So we got to start somewhere. So first of all, why are we doing all this? Well, you know as well as many knows, the UK has ambitious plans to get to net zero by 2050. It's committed to reaching this goal. And it won't be long until we have to reach it. So there's a lot of transformation that actually has to happen, and there is a lot that already happened, and then there's a lot that is going to happen from the net zero strategy to powering up Britain. But you can see the milestone here, and this is continuing nicely. And CBAM is one part of that strategy to reach net zero by 2050. The polluter pays principle is something that you know very well if you have been engaging in CO2 emission reduction discussions, as well as maybe the EU's CBAM or other carbon reduction schemes around the world. But in a nutshell, the polluter pays principle is really relevant here because it says that those that emit greenhouse gases should also bear the principal costs of their pollution. And how it works today in the UK, we have basically one, two, well, maybe three instruments that are relevant in the context of CBAM. First, we have the UK ETS scheme, and we're going to look a little bit into this because this is relevant for our discussion on UK CBAM, because CBAM builds on ETS as it does with the EU scheme. Secondly, we have the CPS, the carbon price support, and then the principle here is the more a company pollutes, the more allowances or taxes it must pay. And that creates then a financial incentive to reduce emissions. And that principle then ensures that the environmental costs of pollution are reflected in the price of goods and services. And that, in a way, then encourages cleaner production and investment in low-tech technologies. So the UK ETS, as I said, was one part of the three-part solution to the environmental carbon polluter pay situation. We call it the UK ETS, the Emission Trading Scheme, and it sets a cap on the total greenhouse gas emissions from certain industries. The companies that are affected, they receive or buy allowances that let them emit a certain amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere or the equivalent gases. And if a company emits less than its allowances, it can sell the extra permits. If it emits more, it must buy additional permits. The total number of allowances available decreases over time and therefore pushing companies to cut emissions, albeit gradually. And that gives them the time to adjust and look into new mechanisms, maybe do some research. The scheme covers major industrial sectors and power generation in the UK and therefore also contributes to helping us meet the climate targets by putting a price on carbon and encouraging cleaner production. The CPS scheme is a tax. It's a tax applied specifically to fossil fuels used in electricity generation, raising the cost of emitting carbon dioxide beyond the UK ETS allowance price. It is kind of a top-up tax, and that ensures a minimum carbon price for power producers, and again, with the goal of encouraging cleaner energy by making coal and gas-fired electricity more expensive compared to low-carbon sources. So it is part of the transition to renewable energy and supports to our climate targets. Now, you might wonder, well, why are you telling me all this? Well, there's a point to it when we get to the question of, what should be the CBAM rate by which I must multiply all of my imports to know what tax I'm going to pay. So the rate, that's from customs duty, 5%, 10%, 20%. Well, what should be that rate? And that rate is tied to all the measures we have in the UK as regards carbon reduction. And these two that you've seen here already is the UK ETS and the CPS. So you can already imagine that these two are going to be part of the CBAM rate by which I have to multiply my emissions. There is a third element that is a little bit, well, it's not really unique to CBAM in a way, but it is a concern. And that's the concern of carbon leakage. Now, carbon leakage, you may have heard in other CBAM schemes, notably the EU one, happens when companies relocate their production or investments to other countries with weaker or no climate regulations, like lower or no carbon pricing. So instead of producing in the UK, because of the CBAM, the ETS situation and the CPS situation, I'm going to relocate to, say, China. And in China, we don't have this, or now in the US, we don't have this leakage, this carbon pricing. And then I'm just going to export everything out of the US or China and then into the UK. Therefore, given that I don't have a tax on imports of carbon at the moment, I'd be avoiding the ETS and the other tax. So we avoid higher costs of strict climate rules at home. And this shift causes problems. Global emissions actually go up because the production moves to a place with less environmental controls, and the home country suffers economically, losing jobs, investment, industrial activity and without achieving a real reduction in global emissions. So carbon leakage undermines climate goals and harms the domestic economy at the same time. So to counterbalance that, before we had CBAM, this is the third element in the whole package of emission reduction schemes. Next to the UK ETS and the CPS, we now have the UK ETS allowances. And these are free allowances. They are emission permits given at no costs to certain companies under the UK ETS. So they are formally a part of the UK ETS, but they do matter in the context of CBAM, as you will see in a moment. And they help industries at risks of carbon leakage, where businesses might move production abroad to avoid carbon costs. Free allowances reduce the financial burden on these sectors while encouraging them to cut emissions, balancing climate goals with economic competitiveness. So we're giving these out for free. And as a result, you don't need to move away because actually, instead of making you pay, we will just, kind of give them to you for free, which to me kind of undercuts the entire system. But in their wisdom, I'm sure they know what they're doing. So if you want to understand how the free UK allowances work, the government allocates a certain number of emissions permits to eligible companies for free. Each allowance lets the company emit a set of amount of greenhouse gases, usually 1 ton of CO2 equivalent. Then companies use these free allowances to cover part of the emissions without paying. If emissions exceed free allowances, companies must buy the extra permits from the market. If emissions are below their allowances, as I've already explained, they can sell the leftover permits for profits. And over time, the total number of free allowances are reduced to encourage companies to cut emissions. So step-by-step approach. So I've already explained that in a way, but this is important because if you think about the fact that in the UK today, there are already free allowances, then the CBAM rate that we need to calculate later also needs to reflect the fact that there are already CBAM free allowances. So if the goal is to put the domestic industry in par with the importing industry so that there is no difference, we need to make sure that the rate we reach at the end, the payment we have to make for bringing CBAM goods into the country, reflects broadly what is paid by the polluter inside the country. And as you know, the three parts that matter here are the CPS, the UK ETS under normal circumstances, but then adjusted to account for the free allowances, if you kind of get my gist. So just let that sink for a moment. Let's recap what we've just said because it will be relevant. We're moving away from this now to get into CBAM, but I just wanted to preface all of this to make sure that you when I later refer to the UK ETS and also other taxes and free allowances and all of that kind of makes sense, right? So hopefully it now does. So what we are saying is the UK trading scheme, emissions trading scheme, is the primary tool for carbon pricing at the moment inside the country, inside the UK. It uses a cap and trade system by industries buy or trade allowances for their emissions, with the total cap decreasing over time. Currently, import goods aren't subject to UK ETS, and that creates this disparity I was talking about in carbon pricing and a risk of carbon leakage, as I've explained, where production's emissions move overseas to avoid higher UK production costs, or carbon costs, I should say, undermining global emissions reduction efforts. And the main anti-leakage measure has been the free allocation of allowances through the UK ETS, and that shields some of the firms from the full carbon price. Though these free allowances, they're set to decrease after time and hopefully by 2027. So at some point, we got to phase them out. Now, with that in mind, welcome to the UK CBAM. So to counter the increasing carbon leakage risk, as the UK intensifies its effort for decarbonisation, the government is now introducing CBAM, the UK Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It'll ensure that the carbon-intensive imported goods face also a carbon price like inside the country. And that should be comparable to the price paid by the UK producer, preventing therefore emission displacement and ensuring genuine global emission reduction. So what's the interlinkage between the two? The new UK Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism will work hand in hand with the UK ETS. The CBAM rate will consider these free allowances, ensuring imported goods face a carbon price similar to what a UK producer pays. And this helps to level the playing field and further reduce carbon leakage risk. And this then helps us achieve the net zero goals when the UK authority for ETS is reducing the number of allowances bit by bit, up to, I think, quite by 45%, so quite significantly. That will mean that the CBAM rate that we need to calculate our CBAM obligations will also decrease. So there's this mechanism whereby CBAM and ETS work hand in hand. If one reduces, the other one will also change. So what's the implementation timeline? Look, it is coming into force, scheduled for the 1st of January 2027. It includes several critical steps until we get there, and some we've already passed, and some we are currently in, and some we are approaching quite quickly. So the past milestone obviously have to do with consultation. There was an initial consultation, then there was a detailed policy consultation, after which some decisions were made, which we'll cover in this webinar as well. Then we had, we have the publication of primary legislation, which is currently laid before the government, before Parliament, I should say. That is the primary legislation. So as you know, in the UK, we have primary and secondary legislation. The primary legislation, in a nutshell, is the what do we want to do? What's the vision? What is the broad infrastructure? How is it supposed to look? The primary legislation will not help you to actually do it. You need secondary legislation, which is the how do I? And when do I do it? And what tools do I have? So the details, the implementation. So all of that secondary legislation is still forthcoming. And obviously, we will have extensive guidance on how to do. And then the date is the January 2027. I think it is the 1st of January 2027. This is when CBAM goes into force. And the deadline for the first return, though, and payment under the CBAM should not be before May 2028. So by the time of this recording, significantly earlier than January 2025, 7 in 2025, in fact, we are now. This is still future music. So launch date, 1st of January 2027. And I'm not going to repeat what I've already said because that's when the CBAM should go live. So that means if you count this back, the time to prepare is now. And that's why it is great to have a first look at how CBAM is going to operate in the UK. So let's get right into it. What are the products concerned? Well, the products concerned are aluminium, fertilizer, cement, hydrogen, iron, and steel sectors. So this is interesting for several reasons. First of all, if you have compared this with the European Union's version, you will already know that not every product that is included here is no, the other way around. The EU has more products in there, for example, electricity, that is not covered here by UK CBAM. And to start off with, we were considering adding glass and ceramics into the CBAM, and after consultation, this was removed. So we're left with aluminium, fertilizer, cement, hydrogen, and iron and steel sectors, with glass and ceramics excluded. Now, if you know anything about any of these sectors, you know that they are very, very different. Producing something made out of steel sheets, steel plates, and aluminium, it's quite similar, but not the same. In contrast to that, cement is completely different, the production is completely different to aluminium and iron steel for obvious reason. And then even hydrogen, again, a completely different kettle of fish, if you want. So why these groups? Why are these ones selected? And note also that I mentioned groups. So these are a family of aluminium products. And as you can know, hydrogen, but also iron, especially iron and steel, they have primary forms and then they have processed forms. So there is more raw iron coming out of the earth, iron ore, or unwrought aluminium. And then this turns then into aluminium products that are highly processed. They undergo multiple stages of production and also multiple what we call installations. So they are heating and cooling production processes. You add some input material, and out comes the next part of the production process, which then in turns is the precursor for the next section of the production process. So to get a flat iron sheet, for example, you would need to go through multiple stages of productions, and in every stage, you would add some heat or some cooling ingredient. You would add some other processes, and then you would have chemical or physical reactions that would then get you every step a little bit closer to your final, say, iron sheet. And so that means there is a lot of processing happening. At every stage of these processes, CO2 gets emitted, or CO2e, other greenhouse gas products may also get emitted. So you can already see that here we have products that produce high carbon, and they are quite complex in most cases, depending on the level of production that you need to produce them. So these are called upstream products or downstream products. So depending on where you are on the spectrum, you will have produced more CO2 or less CO2. So key thing to remember here, not one sector is the same. They all have their specificities, their specialties in production method. They produce a lot of CO2, and there is a risk of carbon leakage here, which is why they've been chosen. So this is where people are believing that these could be moved elsewhere if there's no mechanism for it. Now, to be more specific, we will have details of what these sectors mean in the relevant annex of the legislation. And this will be presented by commodity code. So you will be able to identify based on your imports if you have a CBAM good or not. There will also be some exclusions, such as imported scrap products, just as an example. So we need to look out for what those are, so that we are assessing, first of all, whether CBAM is a concern for us or not. And also, we know that the UK tariff changes, and that affects commodity codes. And therefore, it could also be that the CBAM obligation is affected. So there needs to be alignment between the UK tariff and the CBAM regulation. So we will see that. And that will make sure that we are not seeing unintended inclusions or exclusions. So dynamic alignment, I guess you could call it. In very good news, the UK seems to learn from the big sisters' errors and is already straight going into a minimum threshold situation, which means that the UK will only apply CBAM if the cumulative value of CBAM-related imports within a rolling 12-month period reaches or exceeds £50,000. So that means a company importing steel products worth 45,000 in the last 12 months will not pay a UK CBAM. But if their import reaches 50,000 or more within that period, CBAM would apply. The liable person is the next one we're going to look at, and that is the person that's responsible for the CBAM. So we need to make sure we know who that is. This can be an individual responsible for the goods when they are released for free circulation, if the customs controls apply, or if for whatever reason they don't, it'll be the person on whose behalf the goods enter the UK, if there are no customs controls. So in other words, there will be a person liable. Now, individual, I'm not sure that relates to a person, an individual, one person, but more of a group, I would think. The ORIN number that's listed in the customs declaration will be the person liable, the one that says I'm an importer. And if there's an indirect representation, well, then it would be well, then we'll have to figure out who's liable for the CBAM. It's probably still going to be the person responsible when the goods are released into free circulation, which is either going to be the broker, unlikely, probably then the importer, if the importer is established in the UK. If the importer is not established in the UK, it'll be the UK person responsible situated in the UK. So the broker, for example. Registration, as I said, is required if you're going to exceed the threshold of 50,000 pounds of value of product in a rolling year. And there will be a forward-looking test and a backward-looking test. And that checks if the CBAM goods expected in the next 30 days will hit the 50,000 pounds threshold. Then liability starts on the day that this is met. And the backward-looking test reviews CBAM goods imported in the previous 12 months. Liability starts on the test application date. So there are two tests that will be applied to check whether you are meeting that threshold requirement. And it's quite similar to what we have in other taxes as well. If the tests are met, and if both tests are met, the forward and the backward-looking tax, then liability begins from the earlier date. And then for that, you do need the liability person, because this liable person that you have identified must then register, keep the import record, submit returns, and pay the CBAM tax. And typically, liable persons have 30 days to register, but the first year allows more time. As you remember, we are starting on the 1st of January, but the first return is not due until, what was it, May 2028. So quite a lot. There's also going to be, as you've just seen, group treatment. So you will be able to treat CBAM obligations under a group. And the details are still to be provided, but HMRC is aware that companies do have group situations and are importing under one AORI number or under multiple. So that's going to be taken into account. But of course, it is better if you have one AORI number, because then it is clear to whom to allocate your CBAM obligations. Now, in the UK, CBAM will be operated as a tax, contrary to the EU, where it is specifically not a tax. Here, it will be based and calculated on the emissions embedded in the products covered. We call them the imported embedded emissions. Embodied emissions, not embedded, embodied emissions. The imported embodied emissions. For this, because we have a tax, we need a tax rate, and that tax rate is the CBAM rate. And it will correspond to the UK carbon price that would have applied if the product had been made in the UK. So the effective CBAM carbon price. And that means if you think about what I said earlier about UK ETS, we need to adjust it, because sometimes there's a free allowance and sometimes there is not. So adjustment to the carbon tax have to be made. In addition to the UK ETS, the free allowances, and the CPS tax, which I've mentioned earlier, is similar to the EU version of CBAM. We need to deal with the fact that in other countries, there might be a CBAM tax or a carbon price already paid. So if in one country a carbon price has already been paid, then you should not be forced to pay that again. And therefore, you can deduct the carbon price from your price. So you calculate the tax obligation, you deduct the carbon price, and you reach your new carbon obligation, because the carbon price in the country of production, say India, was already paid. So if you paid it again in the UK, it would be a double payment. So you can deduct the carbon price, and all of that leads you to hopefully go to countries where we can benefit from such deduction. So CBAM will be understood in the UK to be a domestic tax applied after import to comply with the Good Friday Agreement and the Windsor Framework, unlike the EU CBAM, which operates at the border and requires certificates, purchases, and surrenders. Now to the payments, the UK payments. So as it is a tax, CBAM requires parties to meticulously account for all CBAM eligible goods that cross a tax point within each accounting period. Wow, that introduces us into taxes and into accounting periods and tax points. Oh no. At the conclusion of every accounting period, these liable parties will be required to submit an online tax return and settle their accumulated CBAM liability. For the inaugural annual accounting period, which spans from January 1 to 2020 2027 to December 31st, 2027, the corresponding payments will be due by the end of May 2028. So the first year will be the 1 year, and then we move into quarterly payments. And that is interesting because the EU does it exactly the reverse. So in the EU, we're currently in the transitional period on 4 months reporting, and we are moving to an annual reporting. UK does it exactly reverse. It's quite interesting. What should be put on the CBAM tax return? Identified CBAM goods, the specific CBAM goods imported during the period, identified by their commodity code at the tax point, including original CBAM goods processed into non-CBAM goods under special procedures. Now, we already know that there are UK special procedures in customs, and they could change a CBAM product to something else. However, that doesn't mean that at import, the CBAM product wasn't there. It's, the iron and steel that I imported to make a car is now in the car, but it is in the car. So we need the identified CBAM goods. We also need the weight of the goods, the total weight of all imported CBAM goods, which we know by customs declaration. The embodied emissions, the total emissions that are applicable. Then we can deduct the carbon price, as I mentioned. Any effective carbon price already paid in those CBAM goods overseas can be deducted. And then we need to talk about the tax point. For the initial accounting period, the specific quarter in which CBAM goods passed the tax point. So all of these things go into your tax return, which is okay. We can identify the CBAM goods. We can get the weight of the goods. We're going to be struggling with the embodied emissions, I think. And we might have a challenge with the carbon price. The tax point should be fine. What's the CBAM accounting period? Well, there is a return obligations. Liable persons must submit an online CBAM tax return for every accounting period from registration until deregistration, even if they have a nil liability. I've already explained to you what the first accounting period is. And then I've already explained, or I haven't explained actually, that for subsequent accounting periods, they will go into quarterly scenario. So returns and payments will be due with a 2 months window. In the EU, it's just one. Well, it's one to change, actually, to amend. There's no such thing as a tax payment point. So returns and payments will be due within a 2 months window after the end of each quarter. And that's an extension from the initial proposed 1 month. Now we're moving to 2 months, which is good, which I think is going to help. There will also be quite a bit of flexibility because obviously the UK knows this is a burden, an additional burden, additional red tape for businesses. So they're trying to do what they can to really target those that are really affected. So at the end of it all, there'll be data flexibility. And there is an opportunity for you to declare data based on verified emission data and carbon price information that is publicly available. So that brings us to the question: if we know when the tax return, the CBAM tax return, has to be submitted, that brings us now to the money, to the question of how much. So in order to understand how much, we need to understand what's the CBAM liability going to be like. There is going to be the initial CBAM liability that we need to calculate, and we're going to calculate by multiplying the imported embodied emissions, so the emissions associated with the production of the imported goods, by the CBAM rate. That's it. So the emissions times the rate gives you the liability. Boom. And then applying the carbon price relief, you can make a reduction of this relief. The relief is calculated by multiplying the relevant imported embodied emissions by the deductible carbon price. And so that then gives you the CBAM liability, which is the final amount after deducting any applicable carbon price relief from the initially calculated liability. So step 1, get the initial liability. Step 2, apply carbon price relief onto that result to get the final carbon liability. So here it is. We have the UK carbon liability, which is imported embodied emissions times the CBAM rate minus relevant imported embodied emissions times the deductible carbon price. Voila, that's it. Easy. Easy so far, except one thing we don't know, what is the CBAM rate, right? So we can get assuming that you can get the embodied emission, what will be the CBAM rate? How is that determined? So the CBAM rate will apply per ton of embodied emissions in CBAM goods and align with the carbon price UK domestic producers face after accounting for reductions. And as I've explained, this means that the rate will incorporate the UK ETS, the carbon price support, the CPS, and the free allowances, everything we covered at the very beginning. So that makes up the CBAM rate. And since the UK ETS and CPS are also price indirect emissions, those costs are included in the rate. So we don't know what the overall figure is going to be, but we know how it's going to get calculated. And as I've already explained, if there was an overseas carbon price, that you can deduct it. Okay, so here are some of the more details as to what you need to think about when you think about that carbon price. At this point, it is more of a concept. I don't think that there are so many countries that have such a carbon price. The EU, Switzerland, Norway, and maybe Iceland and Liechtenstein are obviously exceptions to this, but maybe in the future there'll be more. And then there should be a mechanism for deducting that. This brings us to a very hot potato. And that hot potato is, of course, the other piece of the puzzle. So we're just going to go back twice, 3 times here. So the UK CBAM liability is the imported embodied emissions times the CBAM rate. We kind of explained what is the CBAM rate, but you know how I skillfully avoided talking about the imported embodied emissions. Now we got to talk about them because you need to determine them. So how are you going to determine them? Well, first you need to measure them, I guess. You need to go to the factory and figure out how much emissions your steel has when you produce it. So steel sheet has produced how much emissions? So that's the question, and that is what you have to figure out. And if you are dealing with the EU CBAM, you know what a pain in the butt that is. But be that as it may, we gotta understand what the UK wants us to do. So the UK says that importers or liable persons, they must report the embedded emissions in so-called tons of CO2e, which is carbon dioxide in equivalent. Now, let's talk about that later. But so there is a ton percentage here of emissions of CBAM goods. So first of all, we need the CBAM goods, then we need tons, and then we need equivalent CO2. So there are 2 ways that you can get this. You can either obtain them, they are independently verified data from someone who went into the factory, say in Ohio, and measured or calculated and gave a report to you that said, here are the emissions. Now, in case you're not owning the factory, or in case somebody is rejecting to give you that information, then you actually will be able to use government provided default values. And these are officially available and shouldn't go away. So the EU did this for a period and then kind of disallowed it, which causes a very concerning situation in the EU whereby we need to kind of force our factory workers to start completing Excel sheets and whatnot. So the UK said, no, we are not going to do that. We are going to allow you to use our data, which means you can file CBAM reports with default values provided by the UK government, which means you don't really have to ask anybody to provide you anything because you can just use the default values. Now, obviously, the UK is going to bump up their default values and make it less favorable for you to use those because you're going to pay a higher rate. So the UK is going to give you a higher default value than what you would normally pay if you would ask in your own factories, somewhere in America or somewhere in China or Australia or Argentina or wherever. So all of that means what? It means it is in your interest to try to get the emissions from the source rather than rely on default values. But if you need to, you can, contrary to the EU. So therefore, you have it. In really good news, if actual data isn't available, importers can use default emission values. From January 1st, 2027, a single default value will be set for each CBAM good, with the government considering alternative approaches for default values beyond 2027. The government will confirm the calculation method and publish these values before CBAM launches. And there will also be alternative approaches for default values. Okay. And that brings us to the finishing touches of this presentation. And that, unfortunately, is what happens if you don't play ball. You don't participate, or you just ignore it. Penalties. Look, penalties are, of course, something that HMRC doesn't want to get involved in much, if not needed. But if need to, if the CBAM obligations are being ignored, then there are ways that HMRC can turn up the heat. Now, here are some of the penalties that you might get if you are not performing to the required standards. And there might be new regulatory penalties for non-compliance with specific CBAM rules and regulations. And if you do that to avoid tax, well, then, then you're in hot water, so to speak. Okay, so let's not cut corners. Let's just prepare well, and then we are ready to go without fear. Now, I want to use this slide here to talk about, to sum it all up and to give my opinion before we wrap this up. So we are in the design and implementation phase right now. There are more details that we need in order to be able to actually go ahead. However, nothing is stopping us from using past experience, notably with the EU, to already, set the groundwork for successful CBAM start in January 2027. So what does that mean? It means that, if you know what the EU has said regarding what aluminium products are in scope, what iron and steel products are in scope, fertilizers and whatnot, you can see the EU CN codes on the website of the EU Commission. Well, there's an argument that that could include most UK goods would also be kind of in that same space. In the background, of course, we think about the rapprochement, the new relationship between the EU and the UK, which could also mean that there's more alignment now. We heard the announcement that the UK and the EU will not require CBAM compliance from each other. That is in the planning stages. So if that happens, that would be really good news, but it's not confirmed at the point of this recording. So but that also speaks to closer alignment as much as possible. The key thing to remember is that CBAM is a tax and a tax that will be applied from 2027. It has a long implementation phase of a year, by which you take our time to get the guidance in order to do the things that are necessary. In the end, it'll be just a tax to report, another tax to report, and we should be able to pull or report an MSS report, a customs report with all our imports by commodity code to assess how many CBAM products we imported over the year 2027. And then thereafter, every quarter, that automatically gives us gross and net weight because customs declarations require that, which is another important factor for our tax return, as we remember. And the carbon price, by then we will know which countries are able to charge a carbon price or not. If that is not available, then, well, we won't just deduct anything. In really, really good news, the EU is not committing the same errors as the EU did, and they are going for default values, which is permanent and which is a super simplification because this entire dance of requesting companies to tell us their exact carbon figures can be avoided. Now, I'm aware that the goal of the whole thing is it was supposed to be to incentivize companies not in the EU, or in this case, in the UK, to think about their carbon efficiency and their reduction of carbon emissions. And that might be thrown out of the window if you just declare default values. If you kind of follow my argument here, if you encourage people to declare their actual values, you can work on a plan to reduce it because you can correlate the money that you have to pay at import with the CO2 deduction from that company. So anyone who can reduce the duty, can reduce the CO2 emissions will automatically reduce the costs of importation, which is really great. So default values are there to simplify your life in case you get a no response from your Chinese customer or your Japanese customer. You can still import into the UK using the more expensive default values, which then will trigger another conversation, I suppose, about why should we pay this higher price if we don't really need to. The other point that's really interesting is that CBAM is a tax as opposed to not a tax as per the EU law. So the fact that it is a tax is for us not a problem, whether you pay it that way or that way, it doesn't matter. Actually, it is simpler that way because it fits into the structure of the UK tax system. Whether it's VAT, we make a VAT return, whether it's corporate tax, we make a corporate tax return. So we just do another return, which doesn't actually might not be as complicated as we think it might be at this point. As I said, the key sticking points will be to determine the direct and indirect emissions, and this can be offset by the default values if you don't want to go down the route of starting to calculate within the factory. And the final point that's really good is the de minimis, the threshold, the £50,000 value threshold, which I also think is pretty good because it excludes effectively all those small and medium enterprises and all those occasional steel and aluminum importers straight away, which again is just something that makes sense and makes sure that we can have impact on our carbon emission reduction whilst not penalizing the smallest amongst us. So in total, we are at a stage where we are introducing something very similar to what we know from the EU. There are nuances of differences. We also noticed a very generous de minimis. We noted that there is default values by default, which is really great. And everything sounds a lot more smoother than the implementation of the EU, also because we are introducing it as a tax and we're not sugarcoating or working around something else, and we are just saying it's a tax, and we have a tax return to do. So that is the state of play. The primary legislation has been laid. The secondary legislation at the time of this recording has not been laid, and further guidance is yet to come. With that, I will draw it to a close. Now, if you're watching this on remand, on a recording, then you can always send me your emails, your question by emailing info@customsmanager.org, and then I'll respond back with any of the questions that you had with a response. Thank you very much for watching, and don't forget these slides are also available for you to download, as well as this recording was and is. So thank you so much for your attention, and that's it. Thank you.